Calhoun County, Tennessee. Summer 1938. James Dawson learned about ricochets before he learned about algebra, which probably explained why he was better at one than the other. The education came courtesy of his father's limestone quarry, where 12-year-old Jimmy spent summer afternoons watching drilling crews punch holes into the pale gray rock that formed the backbone of eastern Tennessee's economy. "See that, boy?" His father, Robert Dawson, pointed to a steel drill bit that had just snapped against an unexpected seam of flint embedded in the limestone. The bit hadn't shattered straight backward as expected. Instead, it had deflected at a sharp angle, carving a groove through softer stone before embedding itself 3 feet from the original impact point. Hard meets hard. Something's got to give. But hard meets soft at the right angle, and you get deflection instead of destruction. The lesson stuck with Jimmy in ways his father never intended. While other boys in Calhoun County spent their teenage years thinking about baseball and girls, Jimmy Dawson thought about angles. He'd lie on his back in the grass behind the quarry office, throwing rocks at the limestone face, watching how different trajectories and impact points created different ricochet patterns. Flat angles produced long, shallow deflections. Steep angles either penetrated or shattered. But there was a sweet spot, somewhere around 20 to 30 degrees, where a projectile would compress, redirect, and carry forward with almost undiminished energy. His high school physics teacher, Mr. Halloran, noticed the obsession during Jimmy's junior year. "Most students struggle with vector mathematics," Halloran said, examining Jimmy's notebook filled with hand-drawn diagrams of ricochet angles. "You seem to understand it instinctively." "It's just rocks and rocks, sir," Jimmy replied. "Same as the quarry." "It's momentum transfer and angular deflection," Halloran corrected. "The same principles that govern artillery trajectories and armor penetration." The phrase armor penetration meant nothing to Jimmy in 1940. 2 years later, with German Panzers rolling across North Africa and American boys dying in tanks that couldn't match European engineering, those words would mean everything. Jimmy enlisted 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, lying about his age by 4 months to make the December 1941 recruitment deadline. His father drove him to the enlistment office in Knoxville without speaking, the same silent disapproval he'd shown when Jimmy dropped out of high school to work the quarry full-time. But at the recruiting station, Robert Dawson shook his son's hand with unexpected firmness. "You see angles other men don't," his father said. "That'll keep you alive when being brave gets other boys killed." The Army assigned Private James Dawson to armored forces based on an aptitude test that flagged his spatial reasoning scores as exceptional. He scored poorly on mechanical maintenance, barely passed radio operation, but when they put him in front of a tank gunner's sight and asked him to calculate firing solutions, something clicked. The geometry of the quarry translated perfectly to the geometry of ballistics. What the instructors taught as memorized firing tables, Jimmy understood as physics. Trajectory wasn't a number on a chart, it was a visible arc he could visualize in 3 dimensions. Range wasn't a measurement, it was the relationship between velocity, gravity, and time. And when a training accident at Fort Knox demonstrated something the manuals said was impossible, Jimmy Dawson was the only person in his battalion who understood exactly why it had worked. That understanding would travel with him across the Atlantic, through the chaos of the Anzio beachhead, and into the gunner's seat of an M4 Sherman tank on a March morning when impossible would become necessary. Fort Knox, Kentucky, November 1943. The accident that changed everything happened on Range 7 during a live-fire exercise that was already going poorly. Second Lieutenant Morrison, fresh from officer candidate school and desperately trying to prove himself, had ordered Dawson's training crew to engage a derelict M3 Lee tank positioned as a target at maximum effective range. "Gunner, target tank, 1,200 yards," Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom. Dawson acquired the target through his sight, made the elevation adjustment by the book, and waited for the fire command. Beside him, his loader, a thick-necked farm kid from Iowa named Kowalski, had already loaded the practice round. Fire! Dawson squeezed the trigger. The Sherman bucked. Through his sight, Dawson watched the tracer arc downrange and impact 50 yards short, striking the frozen Kentucky mud with enough force to throw up a geyser of dirt. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. The shell didn't bury itself in the ground. The hardpan, frozen solid from 3 days of below-freezing temperatures, compressed the projectile's nose on impact. The shell redirected upward at an acute angle, traveled another 60 yards in a rising arc, and punched through the side armor of the target tank at the precise point where the hull met the suspension. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski breathed. "Did you see that?" The range officer's voice exploded over the radio. "Cease fire! Cease fire! What the hell just happened?" Lieutenant Morrison scrambled out of the tank commander's hatch, binoculars pressed to his face. The range safety team was already rolling toward the impact site in a jeep, trying to understand how a short round had somehow hit the target. Dawson sat frozen in the gunner's seat, his mind replaying the impact sequence. The angle of incidence had been roughly 23 degrees. The frozen ground had acted like stone, providing a hard surface for deflection rather than soft earth that would absorb energy. The shell's ballistic cap had compressed but not shattered, redirecting the projectile's momentum upward and forward. Elementary physics, but applied in a context no one had considered. "Dawson, get out here!" Morrison shouted. The investigation took 3 hours. Range officers examined the impact crater, measured angles, and photographed the damage to the target tank. Dawson stood at attention while a colonel he'd never met before asked him increasingly technical questions about his aim point and firing solution. "Private, were you attempting to ricochet the round?" the colonel asked. "No, sir. I was short on the range estimate." "But you observed the deflection." "Yes, sir. And you understand why it occurred?" Dawson hesitated. Explaining physics to a colonel seemed like a good way to get assigned to latrine duty. "The ground was frozen solid, sir. Shell bounced instead of digging in." The colonel exchanged glances with the range officer. "That shouldn't provide sufficient deflection for target impact. The angle was too shallow." "The shell compressed on impact, sir," Dawson said carefully. "Changed its profile. That altered the deflection angle enough to redirect it upward." "How do you know that?" "I watched it happen, sir, through the sight." What Dawson didn't say was that he'd been watching ricochets his entire life, that he'd calculated similar deflections with limestone rocks when he was 14, that the physics of the impact were as clear to him as reading a sentence. Some knowledge you kept to yourself in the Army. The colonel dismissed him with a warning about range discipline, and the incident disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of training reports. But Sergeant Frank Kowalski, who'd been promoted to tank commander the following week and specifically requested Dawson as his gunner, never forgot. "You did that on purpose," Kowalski said 2 days later, watching Dawson clean the gun breech. "I missed." "Sergeant?" "Bullshit. I saw your face after impact. You weren't surprised. You were thinking." Dawson didn't confirm or deny, he just kept cleaning, kept thinking about frozen ground and deflection angles and the fact that German tanks had armor too thick for American guns to penetrate from the front. But what if you didn't shoot from the front? What if you shot from below? 3 months later, Corporal James Dawson shipped out to Italy with Company B, 1st Armored Regiment, carrying a theory he prayed he'd never have to test. Anzio, Beachhead, Italy. February 1944. They called it the factory because it processed American boys into casualties with industrial efficiency. The Anzio beachhead was supposed to be a bold flanking maneuver that would unhinge the German defensive line and open the road to Rome. Instead, it became a 6-mile-deep killing zone where Allied forces were pinned against the Tyrrhenian Sea, by German artillery that had every square yard pre-registered for fire. Corporal Jimmy Dawson arrived on February 3rd, wading ashore from a landing craft while German 88mm shells bracketed the beach in methodical patterns. His tank, christened Rebel 3 by its previous crew, sat hull-deep in Italian mud with a broken track assembly and a 5-inch hole in the turret where a shell fragment had punched through during the initial landing. "Welcome to Hell's waiting room," Sergeant Kowalski said, surveying the damaged Sherman. "We wait here until the Germans decide to kill us or the war ends. Whichever comes first." The maintenance crews had Rebel 3 operational within 48 hours, but operational didn't mean effective. The German defensive positions surrounding the beachhead were anchored by dug-in Panzer IVs and Panthers that could destroy Shermans from ranges where American return fire simply bounced off sloped frontal armor. Dawson watched it happen 11 times in the first 3 weeks. American tanks would spot German armor, maneuver for firing position, and get obliterated by 75mm or 88mm rounds that penetrated Sherman armor like paper. The mathematics of armor warfare were brutally simple. German tanks had better guns, thicker armor, and superior optics. American tanks had numbers, but numbers meant nothing when you couldn't penetrate the target. "It's the slope," Kowalski explained during a maintenance break, gesturing at a destroyed M4 that sat 300 yards from their position. "Their frontal armor isn't actually that much thicker than ours, but the angle deflects our shells. We'd need to hit them from the side or rear, and they're not stupid enough to give us that shot." Dawson stared at the wrecked Sherman, his mind working through the geometry. Sloped armor worked by increasing the effective thickness through angular presentation. A 50mm plate at 60 degrees became equivalent to 100mm of vertical armor. But that same principle worked in reverse for surfaces that faced downward. The belly pan of a tank, the track assemblies, the lower hull plate. All of those were either horizontal or angled away from ground-level threats. "What if we didn't shoot at the front?" Dawson asked. "Then we'd need them to turn around, which they won't." "What if we shot under them?" Kowalski looked at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Under them. Through the ground." "Off the ground," Dawson corrected, "like that shot at Knox. That was an accident. Accidents are just physics we weren't planning for." The idea germinated over the next 3 weeks as Dawson watched German tactics from Rebel 3's various defensive positions. The Panzers operated from hull-down positions, showing only their turrets and thick frontal armor. They'd fire, reverse behind cover, reposition, and fire again. Standard armored doctrine when you had the superior equipment. But hull-down meant the vehicle's belly and tracks were planted on relatively level ground, protected from direct fire but theoretically vulnerable to indirect approaches. The problem was that indirect fire meant artillery, and artillery at Anzio was either unavailable, delayed, or falling on American positions because German counter-battery fire was faster and more accurate. Tank crews couldn't rely on artillery support. They had to solve the armor problem with the tools they had: 75mm guns that couldn't penetrate frontal armor but could potentially reach vulnerable undercarriages if the geometry worked. Dawson started carrying a notebook, sketching ricochet angles during the long hours of defensive vigilance. Kowalski noticed but didn't comment until he found Dawson using a protractor to measure angles on a terrain map. "You're serious about this," Kowalski said. "We're losing 3 tanks for every Panzer we kill," Dawson replied. "Someone's got to think of something." "That someone being a corporal from Tennessee who barely graduated high school?" "I didn't graduate high school," Dawson corrected. "And yeah, that someone is me." March 15, 1944. 3 days before the mathematics of ricochet weren't in any Army field manual, so Dawson had to reconstruct them from memory and first principles. He worked by candlelight in Rebel 3's cramped interior, filling pages with diagrams that would have looked insane to anyone who didn't understand what he was attempting. The variables were complex: projectile velocity, impact angle, ground hardness, shell construction, and distance to target. Change any one factor and the entire equation collapses. A ricochet that worked on frozen Kentucky dirt might fail completely on soft Italian soil. An M61 armor-piercing shell might compress and deflect differently than the practice rounds he'd used at Knox. "You need test data," said Private Eddie Martinez, Rebel 3's loader, who'd been watching Dawson's obsessive calculations with growing interest. "Can't theory your way through this. You need to actually shoot at the ground and see what happens. Can't exactly requisition ammunition for ricochet experiments," Dawson replied. "No, but we've got authorization for zeroing exercises." Martinez grinned. "Nobody specifies what angle you zero at." The zeroing range was a bombed-out vineyard 2 miles behind the front lines, designated for crews to calibrate their sights and test-fire weapons. Kowalski signed them out for a scheduled maintenance check, and Dawson brought his notebook. They fired 6 rounds at progressively shallower angles, targeting a section of rain-hardened ground in front of a burned-out German supply truck. The first 3 shells buried themselves uselessly in the dirt. The fourth, fired at 18 degrees of depression, skipped like a stone on water, deflecting upward but losing too much energy to be effective. The 5th round, fired at 22 degrees, compressed on impact and redirected upward in a controlled arc that punched through the truck's undercarriage 60 yards past the impact point. "Holy shit," Martinez whispered. "It actually works." "Once," Kowalski cautioned, "under controlled conditions, against a stationary, unarmored target." Dawson was already calculating. The deflection angle had been approximately 38 degrees, which matched his theoretical predictions. The shell had retained enough velocity after impact to penetrate 15 mm of steel plate. A Panzer's belly armor was typically 25 mm, which meant he'd need either a harder impact surface or a more direct deflection angle to achieve penetration. "The ground has to be hard enough," Dawson muttered, sketching furiously. "Calcium-rich soil or rocky substrate. If it's too soft, the shell just buries. If it's too hard, the shell shatters." "So you need perfect conditions," Kowalski said. "Perfect ground, perfect angle, perfect distance. In combat. Against an enemy tank that's actively trying to kill you." "I need one good shot," Dawson corrected. "One chance to prove it works." That chance came 3 days later, when intelligence reported German armor moving into positions that threatened the entire northeastern sector of the beachhead. Battalion Command positioned Company B's Shermans in a defensive arc with orders to delay enemy advancement until artillery support could be coordinated. Dawson spent the night of March 17th studying topographical maps of the sector, identifying areas where the soil composition might provide the hardness necessary for a controlled ricochet. There was a section of farmland northeast of their position, formerly cultivated land that had been compressed by heavy vehicle traffic and dried by 3 days without rain. "You're planning this," Kowalski said, watching him work. "I'm preparing for a possibility. If you miss, that Panzer kills us. If I don't try, that Panzer kills someone else." Dawson met his tank commander's eyes. "I can make this shot, Sergeant. I know I can." Kowalski was silent for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "Then I guess we better make sure you get the chance." Neither man slept that night. 6:47 a.m., March 18, 1944. The world compressed to a circle of magnified vision 8 inches in diameter. Through his gunner's sight, Dawson could see the Panzer IV with crystalline clarity. The angular hull, the long 75mm gun barrel, the commander's cupola rotating as German eyes searched for targets. 680 yards away, hull down behind a collapsed farmhouse, perfectly positioned to slaughter the exposed American infantry in the valley. Dawson's hands moved with mechanical precision. Left hand on the elevation control, depressing the gun barrel to an angle that put his targeting reticle on bare ground 40 yards in front of the enemy tank. Right hand on the traverse, making microscopic adjustments to account for the Panzer's slow forward movement. His breathing slowed to the rhythm he'd learned on the rifle range years ago. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. "Gunner, cease!" Kowalski's voice started through the intercom. Dawson fired. The 75mm cannon's roar was apocalyptic in the confined space of the turret. The recoil mechanism screamed as the gun tube slammed backward, ejecting the spent shell casing in a spray of hot brass that pinged off Martinez's helmet. Smoke flooded the compartment, burning Dawson's eyes, but he kept his face pressed to the sight, watching. The M61 armor-piercing shell crossed 680 yards in 1.4 seconds, traveling at 2,030 feet per second. It struck the rain-hardened Italian soil at precisely the point Dawson had calculated, 42 yards in front of the Panzer's position. The impact crater would later be measured at 18 inches deep, compressed into calcium-rich soil that had been packed solid by centuries of agricultural use and weeks of armored vehicle traffic. The shell's ballistic cap compressed on impact, absorbing the initial shock. The hardened steel penetrator behind it redirected upward as the projectile's momentum transferred from horizontal to angular trajectory. Elementary physics, executed at velocities that made every microsecond critical. Dawson watched the deflection through his sight, saw the shell arc upward in a climbing trajectory that cleared the intervening terrain and rose toward the Panzer's undercarriage at an angle of 36 degrees. The German tank was still moving forward, presenting its belly pan at the exact moment the redirected shell arrived. The M61 punched through 25mm of lower hull armor and into the Panzer's interior structure. Dawson couldn't see the internal damage, the ammunition storage detonation, the hydraulic fluid ignition, the catastrophic failure of the engine compartment, but he saw the result. The Panzer IV lurched to a sudden stop. Smoke erupted from the engine deck. The turret traversed wildly for 3 seconds, then froze. The commander's cupola burst open, and German crew members began evacuating in the desperate scramble of men who knew their vehicle was seconds from catastrophic fire. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Martinez whispered. "You hit it." Kowalski's voice came through the intercom, rough with an emotion Dawson couldn't identify. "Confirm that kill, gunner." "Target neutralized," Dawson replied, his voice steadier than his hands. "Mobility kill. Possible ammunition detonation." Through the sight, Dawson watched the Panzer's crew abandon the vehicle. 7 seconds later, ammunition cooked off inside the tank, blowing the turret 3 feet off its mounting in a geyser of orange flame. The long 75mm gun barrel tilted skyward at a drunken angle, pointing at nothing. The Panzer, that had been about to massacre an American infantry company, was now a burning monument to physics that no military doctrine had anticipated. "Loader, reload," Dawson said. "Same ammunition type." "What?" Martinez stammered. "There's a second Panzer. Grid reference 042, 700 yards, hull down behind the same ridgeline." Dawson's hands were already moving, traversing the gun to acquire the new target. He watched what just happened to his wingman. He's going to displace or engage. Either way, we need to be ready. Kowalski didn't countermand the order. Martinez slammed another M61 into the breach. Dawson acquired the second Panzer through his sight, calculated the ground composition, adjusted for the slightly greater range, and settled his reticle on the hardpan 52 yards in front of the target. The German tank was already moving, reversing out of its hull-down position in tactical retreat. Smart decision. Too late. "Gunner, fire when ready," Kowalski said quietly. Dawson fired again. 6:53 a.m., March 18, 1944, the 2nd Panzer died the same way as the 1st, a deflected shell rising from impossible geometry to punch through belly armor that had never been designed to face ground-based threats. By the time the smoke cleared, 2 of Germany's most effective medium tanks sat burning in the Italian dawn, killed by a technique that didn't exist in any nation's tactical doctrine. Dawson sat motionless in the gunner's seat, his hands still gripping the controls, his mind replaying both shots with the obsessive precision of a man who couldn't quite believe what he'd just accomplished. The mathematics had worked. The physics had held. The desperate theory he'd sketched in a notebook by candlelight had translated into combat reality. "Battalion Net is going insane," Kowalski reported from the commander's position, one hand pressed to his radio headset. "Forward observers are reporting both Panzers destroyed. They're asking what artillery unit provided fire support." "What'd you tell them?" Martinez asked. "I told them it was Rebel 3. Direct fire engagement." Kowalski paused. "They're asking how we achieved penetration at that range and angle." Dawson finally released his grip on the gun controls. His hands were shaking. Delayed adrenaline response. His mind cataloged automatically. "Tell them we got lucky." "That wasn't luck, Jimmy." Kowalski's voice carried an edge Dawson had never heard before, something between awe and unease. "That was the most technically precise gunnery I've ever witnessed. Both shots. You didn't even need a ranging round." "I had the calculations," Dawson said simply. "Calculations for a shot that's not supposed to be possible." Through the forward vision port, Dawson could see American infantry beginning to move through the valley, advancing past the positions where they would have been slaughtered if the Panzers had remained operational. Lieutenant Chen's company. More than 200 men who didn't know they'd just been saved by a Tennessee farm kid who'd spent his childhood watching rocks bounce off limestone. The radio crackled again. "Rebel 3, this is Tomahawk 6. Confirm your engagement method and ammunition type. Fire Control wants a detailed after-action report." Kowalski looked down at Dawson through the turret's internal space. "This is going to be a conversation, Corporal, a long one, with people who have a lot of rank and a lot of questions. I know. They're going to want to know if you can do it again." Dawson thought about the variables: ground composition, range, target movement, impact angle. Thought about the fact that he'd just proven a theory that challenged fundamental assumptions about armored warfare. Thought about the fact that if this technique could be taught, standardized, and distributed to tank crews across the European theater, American Shermans might finally have an answer to German armor superiority. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I can do it again." Martinez let out a breath he'd been holding. "They're going to think you're crazy, or lying. They can think whatever they want." Dawson pulled himself out of the gunner's seat, his muscles stiff from the cramped position and sustained tension. "The Panzers are still burning. That's not theory, that's evidence." Kowalski keyed the battalion net. "Tomahawk 6, Rebel 3. We'll provide full technical details at debriefing. Engagement method was unorthodox, but repeatable. Request permission to remain in position for continued fire support." The response took nearly 30 seconds. When it came, the voice was different, deeper, with the gravitas of field-grade authority. "Rebel 3, this is Tomahawk 6 actual. Permission granted. Maintain position and continue engagement as targets present. All fire missions are authorized at your discretion. Battalion Commander sends well done." The transmission ended. Kowalski looked at his crew. Dawson, Martinez, and their driver, Corporal Bill Henderson, who'd remained silent throughout the engagement, hands locked on the driving controls. "Boys," Kowalski said slowly, "I think we just changed the war." Through the vision port, a third German tank appeared on the ridgeline. Dawson was already moving back to the gunner's seat. "Let's make sure," he said. March 22, 1944. 5th Army Headquarters, Anzio. The canvas tent that served as 5th Army's Tactical Operations Center smelled of cigarette smoke, burnt coffee, and the particular staleness that came from too many officers occupying too small a space for too long. Corporal James Dawson stood at attention in his combat fatigues, still stained with gun oil and Italian mud, while 3 colonels and a brigadier general examined photographs of destroyed German armor. "Walk us through it again," Colonel Richard Hastings said, spreading reconnaissance photos across the map table. "Shot by shot. I want to understand the exact methodology." It was the 4th time Dawson had explained the ricochet technique in 3 days. The first explanation had been to his company commander, who'd listened with visible skepticism. The second had been to battalion staff, who'd brought an artillery officer to verify the mathematics. The third had been to an ordnance expert from Aberdeen Proving Ground, who'd happened to be at Anzio evaluating armor performance. Now he was explaining it to the general staff. And the questions had evolved from, "How did you do this?" to, "How do we teach this?" "The ground composition is critical, sir," Dawson said, pointing to the topographical map. "Soil that's too soft absorbs the shell's energy. Too hard and the projectile shatters. You need packed earth, rocky substrate, or calcium-rich soil that's been dried by weather and compressed by traffic." "So it only works in specific terrain," Brigadier General Paulson observed. "It works best in specific terrain, sir. But most defensive positions involve prepared ground that's been hardened by vehicle movement. The Germans particularly favor hull-down positions on elevated, compacted terrain, which is exactly the environment that supports ricochet deflection." Colonel Hastings tapped one of the photographs. "Your 4th engagement. The Panzer was moving. You still achieved a mobility kill. The deflection angle accounts for target movement, sir. The shell's flight time after ricocheting is approximately 0.4 seconds. That's enough time for a moving tank to travel 6 to 8 feet, which I factored into the initial aim point." "You calculated all of this under combat conditions," Paulson said. It wasn't quite a question. "The calculations become intuitive after the first few shots, sir. Same as any gunnery problem. You internalize the variables." The ordnance expert, a major named Williamson, leaned forward. "Corporal, I've spent 15 years studying armor ballistics. What you're describing requires an understanding of material compression, angular momentum transfer, and dynamic trajectory calculation that most gunners couldn't manage with a slide rule and an hour of preparation. You're doing it in seconds, under fire." Dawson didn't know how to respond to that without sounding either arrogant or evasive. "I watched ricochets my whole life, sir. My father's quarry. It's just physics." "Just physics," Williamson repeated, shaking his head. "Son, you've independently discovered a tactical application of deflection ballistics that our best engineers never considered. That's not just anything." General Paulson stood, walking to the tent's entrance to stare out at the beachhead. 5 confirmed Panzer kills in 4 days, all achieved by ricochet engagement at ranges and angles that bypass frontal armor. 0 friendly casualties during the engagements. He turned back to face the room. "Gentlemen, if this technique can be standardized and taught, we're looking at a fundamental shift in how we engage enemy armor." "There's a problem," Colonel Hastings said. "It violates established fire doctrine. We'd be asking tank crews to aim at the ground instead of the target, to trust physics instead of their training." "Their training is getting them killed," Dawson said, then immediately regretted speaking without being addressed. Paulson smiled slightly. "Continue, Corporal." "Sir, American tank crews are taught to engage enemy armor with direct fire at center mass. That doctrine assumes rough parity in armor protection. Against the Panthers and Panthers, we don't have parity. We have inferior armor and inferior guns. So crews follow doctrine, take frontal shots that bounce off sloped armor and die when return fire penetrates our thinner plating. Dawson gestured at the map. This technique gives Shermans a chance. It's not perfect, it requires specific conditions, but it's better than watching our tanks burn because we're following rules that don't match reality. The tent fell silent. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. "Major Williamson," Paulson said finally, "how long would it take to develop training standards for this technique? If Corporal Dawson works with our gunnery instructors? 2 weeks for initial protocols, another month for field testing and refinement. Make it happen." Paulson looked at Dawson. "Corporal, you're being temporarily reassigned to training development. You'll work with ordnance and fire control to create a standardized approach to ricochet engagement. Can you teach me this?" "Yes, sir." "Then start tomorrow." Paulson extended his hand and Dawson shook it. Acutely aware that brigadier generals didn't typically shake hands with corporals. The Army needs more men willing to think when the manual doesn't have answers. Well done. Fort Knox, Kentucky. July 1944. The same training range where Dawson had accidentally discovered ricochet principles 9 months earlier now hosted the Army's first formal training course on deflection engagement tactics. 32 tank crews from armored divisions preparing for European deployment sat in a semicircle around a blackboard while Corporal Dawson, now Sergeant Dawson, promoted after his return from Italy, explained physics to men who'd signed up to fight, not study. "The angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection," Dawson said, drawing vectors on the blackboard. "But that's only true for perfectly elastic collisions. An armor-piercing shell hitting packed earth isn't elastic, it's plastic deformation. The shell compresses, loses some energy to ground penetration, but redirects the remaining momentum upward." A tank commander from 3rd Armored raised his hand. "Sergeant, how do we calculate all this in combat?" "You don't calculate it. You internalize it." Dawson moved to the terrain model set up beside the blackboard. "You read the ground the same way you read range. Hard ground, shallow angle. Soft ground, steeper angle, or no engagement. You learn to see the geometry." The training syllabus had been developed over 3 months of intensive work with Major Williamson and a team of ordnance engineers. They'd formalized Dawson's intuitive understanding into something that could be taught. Ground classification standards, optimal engagement angles, range tables for ricochet trajectories, and most importantly, recognition criteria for when the technique would work and when it would fail. "The ricochet shot isn't a replacement for direct fire," Dawson emphasized. "It's a tool for specific situations. Hull down enemy armor on prepared ground at medium range. Those are your conditions. You see those conditions? You have an option that didn't exist before." The live-fire demonstration that followed changed minds more effectively than any lecture. Dawson walked each crew through the engagement sequence: terrain assessment, angle calculation, aim point selection. Then each gunner fired a ricochet shot at a captured German tank positioned behind a berm. The success rate was 68% on first attempt. By the 3rd day of training, it had climbed to 84%. "They're learning it," Major Williamson observed, watching a Sherman crew achieve a perfect track-severing hit on their 2nd attempt. "My God, they're actually learning it." "It's not complicated once you see it," Dawson replied. "Same as any gunnery skill." "No, Sergeant, it's not the same." Williamson turned to face him. "Standard gunnery is memorization and repetition. This requires spatial reasoning and adaptive thinking. What you do naturally, most men have to work at." By August 1944, the deflection engagement technique had been incorporated into armored warfare doctrine under the designation indirect ground deflection fire. Training manuals were distributed to every American armored unit in Europe. Gunnery instructors who'd never met Dawson taught his technique to crews who'd never heard his name. The first combat success report came from France in September. A Sherman crew from 2nd Armored Division used deflection fire to disable a Panther that had pinned down an entire infantry battalion. The technique spread through word of mouth faster than official channels could distribute it. Tank crews teaching each other the geometry of survival that doctrine had never anticipated. By December 1944, Army intelligence estimated that deflection fire had destroyed or disabled more than 300 German armored vehicles that would have otherwise been invulnerable to frontal Sherman fire. The technique didn't win the war. American numerical superiority and German fuel shortages did that. But it kept American tank crews alive in engagements they would have lost 6 months earlier. Dawson spent the last year of the war at Fort Knox, training crews and refining the technique. He never returned to combat. Part of him resented that, felt like he was sitting out the fight while men he'd trained were dying in Belgium and Germany. But another part, the part that thought, in angles and vectors, understood that teaching 1,000 gunners was worth more than what one gunner could accomplish alone. On May 8, 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached Fort Knox, Sergeant James Dawson was in the middle of a training lecture. He paused, announced the war's end, and dismissed the class to celebrate. Then he walked alone to Range 7, stood in the spot where an accident had become a revelation, and thought about ricochets and recognition and the strange paths that lead from limestone quarries to changing the calculus of armored warfare. He was 23 years old and had already ensured that his name would appear in footnotes of military history that most people would never read. It would be another 60 years before anyone outside military circles understood what he'd accomplished. Fort Benning, Georgia, April 2007. The Armor School's museum occupied a modern building that stood in deliberate contrast to the historical artifacts it contained. 85-year-old James Dawson walked slowly through the exhibit hall, leaning on a cane, tracing a lifetime of evolution in armored warfare from the M4 Sherman to the M1 Abrams. He stopped in front of a display case he'd been told about but hadn't quite believed existed. The placard read, "Deflection Engagement Tactics, Innovation Under Fire." Inside the case sat a cutaway model demonstrating ricochet trajectory, a copy of the 1944 training manual he'd helped write, and photographs of destroyed German armor. At the center was a terrain diorama showing the exact geometry of that first shot at Anzio, the Panzer, the farmhouse, the 40 yards of Italian hardpan that had proven his theory. "We estimated it saved between 300 and 400 Allied tank crews," said Colonel Michael Harrison, the museum's director, standing beside Dawson. "Possibly more. Combat records from that era are incomplete, but every after-action report that mentions deflection fire represents men who came home because you thought differently." Dawson stared at the display. 63 years had passed since that March morning. Most of the men who'd learned his technique were dead now. The Shermans had long since been melted down or turned into museum pieces. Even the Panzers existed only in photographs and scattered survivors preserved as monuments. But the idea survived. "I didn't invent physics," Dawson said quietly. "I just applied it." "That's what innovation is, sir. Seeing applications that others miss." Harrison gestured at the exhibit. "We're updating our armor officer curriculum to include historical case studies of tactical innovation. Your Anzio engagement is the centerpiece, an example of how individual initiative and technical understanding can overcome systemic disadvantages." They moved through the rest of the exhibit. Modern reactive armor, sabot rounds, composite protection systems. The technology had evolved beyond anything Dawson could have imagined in 1944, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Armor and weapons existed in constant evolution, each innovation spawning countermeasures that spawned countermeasures. His contribution had been one small deflection in that ongoing trajectory. The ceremony that afternoon was modest by military standards. 60 people in the museum's lecture hall, including 4 surviving tank crewmen who'd trained under Dawson at Fort Knox. The Armor School's commandant presented him with a retrospective commendation for his development of deflection engagement tactics and his contribution to armored warfare doctrine. Dawson accepted the framed citation and looked out at an audience that was mostly strangers, young officers who'd grown up with precision-guided munitions and computerized fire control, for whom the idea of bouncing shells off the ground seemed almost quaint. "I was a corporal who got lucky," Dawson said when asked to speak. "I saw something that worked by accident and figured out how to make it work on purpose. That's not genius, that's just paying attention." One of the young officers raised a hand. "Sir, the training records say you violated direct orders to take that first shot. Did you ever regret that decision?" Dawson thought about Sergeant Kowalski's voice in his headset, ordering him to cease fire. Thought about the 200 men in the valley who would have died if he'd obeyed. Thought about the strange calculus of military discipline that sometimes required disobedience in the service of a higher obedience. "No," he said, "I never regretted it. The Army trains you to follow orders, but it also trains you to complete the mission. Sometimes those things conflict. When they do, you make the choice you can live with and accept the consequences." "Were there consequences, sir?" "Almost got court-martialed for damaging government property and violating fire discipline," Dawson replied. The audience laughed, and he smiled. "Then they promoted me and made me teach other people to violate fire discipline in exactly the same way. The Army's funny like that." After the ceremony, Dawson stood alone in front of the exhibit case, studying the trajectory diagram. The mathematics were cleaner than they'd been in his notebook, the vectors precise and color-coded. Someone had reduced his desperate improvisation to elegant geometry. His father had been right all those years ago at the quarry. Hard meets hard, something's got to give. But hard meets soft at the right angle, and you get deflection instead of destruction. Dawson had spent a lifetime understanding angles. Angles of stone and steel. Angles of physics and necessity. Angles of the strange paths that lead from Tennessee limestone to Italian soil to museum cases that tried to capture moments that could never quite be contained. The placard listed his name. Sergeant James Dawson, innovator of deflection engagement tactics, developer of indirect ground fire doctrine, credited with saving an estimated 300 to 400 Allied tank crews through tactical innovation during the Italian campaign, 1944. Numbers and citations and framed recognitions that tried to measure something fundamentally immeasurable, the value of thinking differently when conformity meant death. He touched the glass of the display case gently, feeling the coolness against his fingertips. Somewhere in the physics of that gesture was everything he'd learned and everything he'd tried to teach. When you see an angle others miss, you take the shot. You trust the mathematics. You accept that sometimes the impossible is just the difficult wearing a disguise. And if you're very lucky, 63 years later, someone remembers.